Jane gazed into the mirror once more. The white wedding dress, with its open shoulders and diaphanous lace sleeves, looked simply magnificent on her slender, lithe figure. Pleased with what she saw, the girl smiled happily at her reflection. How long she had waited for this moment. Beautiful young Jane regularly received marriage proposals. It seemed like it was time to get married, but with each new proposal, she found herself deep in contemplation. Another potential groom might seem fine, but try as she might to imagine him as her husband, spending evenings together, going on vacations, she always came to the same conclusion. No, not him. I don't want this. The thought of any suitor becoming her intimate partner was even more unpalatable. Jane was one of those rare girls who didn't rush into physical relationships, preferring to take time to gauge her feelings for a new admirer. Moreover, Jane had another compelling reason not to hurry. None of her suitors had ever managed to seduce her. Perhaps this was because she hailed from a family in a small provincial town. The unhurried, sedate, patriarchal way of life, with its old-fashioned family customs and values, atypical for many modern people, had shaped Jane's upbringing. When Jane was 18, her father suddenly fell ill and died. Her younger sister was still in school, and her mother worked at the local greenhouse as a plant breeder. Money became catastrophically scarce. In their small, quiet town, work was difficult to come by. Jane's options were limited: work with her mother in the greenhouse, become a worker on the farm, or marry a local young man, become a dutiful wife, and live an ordinary, routine life, waiting for her husband to return from work. Jane had resigned herself to her fate and started working in the greenhouse alongside her mother. However, each time Lyneth saw her daughter in a shabby work coat with soil-stained hands, holding a pot of seedlings, she felt that the greenhouse was not Jane's rightful place. It won't be long before this beauty withers away as if it never existed. I was such a beauty in my youth, and what's left of it now? Lyneth thought, gazing at her reflection in the mirror while brushing her long blonde hair, now streaked with grey in the evenings. Lyneth didn't want such a fate for her daughter, not at all. "You should study," she would say, admiring Jane with maternal pride. "You must move to the city. What's here for you?" Her own situation was clear. She was already a widow with a young daughter to raise through school, but Jane deserved a different life than just withering away in this backwater. Oh, the years are flying by, and you can't hold them back. Life has already flown by, as if it never happened. It seems like only yesterday I finished school, and now I have a daughter of marriageable age. Who will be worthy of such a beauty? Lyneth pondered her daughter's fate as she observed the local young men. No, none of them is suitable for my daughter. Young Jane, however, gave little thought to her future, enjoying life carefree. She listened to her mother with half an ear, nodding in response, and so time passed. Finally, Lyneth realized something had to be done. She wouldn't, of course, let her daughter go to a distant city. There remained closer, smaller cities. Trudy, Lyneth's childhood friend, had moved to the city right after they finished school together, and soon found her happiness there. She had married well and now lived in one of these cities, occasionally sending Lilith holiday greetings. Lilith decided to visit her friend and simultaneously scout for a possible relocation for her daughter. If Jane were to move there, at least someone would look after her. The city greeted her with noise unfamiliar to rural ears, even at night. Lilith was surprised by the people hurrying about the streets, jostling among them in a crowded bus. She reassured herself that it would be better for Jane here than in their backwater, and perhaps, like her friend Trudy, Jane might find her happiness here. Her friend lived in a high-rise building on the 12th floor. Cautiously entering the descending elevator, Lyneth rode up to the correct floor and soon rang her friend's doorbell. Trudy herself opened the door. The women embraced, unable to recall when they had last seen each other. Trudy's husband had gone fishing with a friend for the weekend, and her son had left for university in another city. No one would interrupt the friends' reunion. Delighted to see each other, Lyneth and Trudy sat down in the living room and drank tea with strawberry jam and the fresh country pies Lyneth had brought. Trudy added chocolate candy and a cake with cream roses from her husband's pastry shop to the table. Her husband owned a chain of thriving pastry shops known for their quality products. Lyneth savoured her tea, nibbling on a delicate sponge cake with chocolate cream. They chatted about various topics, catching up on all sorts of news. At last Lyneth said, "Trudy, I need your advice and help. My daughter Jane is of marriageable age now, and she's beautiful. You saw her in the photo. I keep looking at her and wondering, will she repeat my fate? You did well moving to the city and choosing a different life, and Lilith trailed off, waving her hand. That's why I wanted to consult you as a city dweller. What can a girl like my Jane expect in the city? What do you think? What advice do you have? I'm worried about my daughter, and I can't go with her." "Well, Lyneth," Trudy pondered, "our city is generally considered safe. We walk the streets even late at night without fear. Occasionally a drunk might cause some noise coming home from a party. We live as well as anyone else, so to speak." She paused. "But you realize that's just in general. Everyone has their own destiny, and anything can happen. Would I advise Jane to move? It's worth a try. I can look after her for a while if necessary, but I'm not sure how my husband would feel about it. I think I can accommodate her temporarily, but beyond that I'm sorry, she'll have to find another place to live." "I see," Lyneth sighed in reply. She hadn't expected Trudy to take her daughter in. Moreover, Jane needed to learn independent adult life, not under someone else's wing, especially when that someone hadn't experienced real life herself. "I'm sorry, Trudy. My daughter is a beauty," Lyneth said anxiously. "And beauty doesn't always lead to good things. You know, I'm even considering not letting her go at all." "I understand," Trudy said, putting her arm around her friend's shoulders. "I can promise you one thing. I'll look after Jane at first, until she gets settled and finds a place to live. We'll call and keep in touch with you, I promise. However, I can't be fully responsible for her. You understand that too," Trudy added seriously. "All right, friend," Lilith replied. "Then expect my daughter next week." With that, they hugged and said goodbye. Upon returning home, Lilith immediately told her daughter the news. They decided that Jane would move to the city and stay at Trudy's house temporarily. She would explore the area, look for a job, and Trudy and her husband would help her. Trudy's husband, being a businessman, had extensive connections, and Lilith was sure, with thanks to them, Jane would soon find a suitable position. But if city life didn't suit her at all, her daughter would return home as if nothing had happened. A few days later, Jane, packed for the journey, boarded the bus to the city. Lilith and Jane's younger sister Sue saw her off, standing by the window until the bus departed. As the engine started, Jane waved to her relatives. "Don't worry, everything will be all right." Lilith couldn't help but shed a final tear. It's one or the other, Lilith thought, wiping away her tears as she and her youngest walked home. I let my daughter go, so why cry now? Or should I have kept her by my side forever like a child? I don't want to see my beautiful daughter repeat my fate. Well, it won't happen. Arriving in town, Jane got off the bus and looked around at the bus stop. She had been to the city before, though not often, on a school excursion and a few times with her girlfriends. Jane quickly orientated herself and, after waiting for the right transport, safely reached her destination. Trudy was at home, already waiting for Jane. Greg wasn't particularly pleased about taking in a friend's daughter from the village. However, his wife stood her ground, promising that as soon as a suitable job for a young girl was found, Jane would move into a rented place. Trudy herself had started the same way in her youth, after moving to the city. Now she enjoyed a happy marriage of many years. Her husband wasn't a millionaire, but they weren't poor either. Things were going well. Their son was growing up and would soon have a life of his own. Many people started small. Jane could do it too. Having climbed to the right floor and rung the doorbell, Jane soon stood in the hallway of Trudy and Greg's apartment. "Hello, Jane." Trudy hugged her. "It's been so long since I've seen you, since you were a child. Greg, come to look at the beauty who's come to us," Trudy called to her husband. Greg emerged from the room, looked at the girl and said, "Yes, indeed, beautiful. She looks like her mother. Your childhood friend, Lyneth." Greg had seen Lyneth only once, at his wedding to Trudy, when he was still young. However, Lyneth's beauty had stayed in his memory. For a moment he even regretted meeting her so late. After feeding her guest, Trudy sat Jane down on the living room sofa and called for her husband. They needed to decide how to help her. Greg came and settled into an armchair. "So, Jane," he said, "how do you plan to start your adult life? Many girls nowadays aim to find a rich patron and live comfortably off his support. What are your plans?" "Uncle Greg, how can you think that of me?" Jane's voice held surprise and hurt, and Trudy took the girl's hand reassuringly. "Greg," she said reproachfully, "how can you say that? Jane grew up in entirely different conditions. She's not looking for rich patrons or relationships based on money." Trudy stroked the girl's hand, comforting her. "Jane, of course, thinks about marriage, but she hasn't made a choice yet. She wants to marry for love." Hearing this, Greg looked at Jane in surprise, not believing such girls still existed. "Wow," he exclaimed. "I didn't know modern young ladies could retain such notions. I apologize, but I had to clarify your plans. No offense. However, we still need to figure out what kind of job you'd like to get." Greg pondered for a moment. He had never believed that truly beautiful women could be paragons of morality, especially when life teaches such women quickly. Beauty is a valuable commodity that sells well, particularly when an admirer with money and opportunities appears. Once a young beauty tastes the benefits of a prosperous life, she quickly understands how to use her natural gift profitably. And this girl? Her case seemed clear. Patriarchal principles, old-fashioned views on life. The question was, how long would her principles last in the city? "All right, Jane," Greg said. "How do you feel about trying to work as a salesperson? I can have you start behind the counter in one of my pastry shops. You can look around and get to know people. The job isn't particularly difficult. You'll just need to learn our product line to answer customers' questions. You'll probably need to get a health certificate to satisfy the inspection authorities. In about a week, one of our sellers is leaving, so if everything goes well, you'll replace her. Meanwhile, you can start helping her out a bit. You'll learn from her." "Great!" Jane nodded happily in response. As night approached, it was decided to put Jane in the room of Trudy and Greg's son, who was studying at a university in another city. Trudy made the bed for the girl and wished her good night. The bed felt unaccustomedly soft to Jane. The old beds, with their old mattresses and feather pillows in their village house, were no match for this one. Lying in bed, Jane couldn't fall asleep. She couldn't fully grasp that her life might change forever. Whether it was good or bad, she couldn't even fully understand. The idea of moving had been more her mother's than her own. Jane had lived contentedly in their rural setting, under her mother's wing, though she realized there were no prospects for her there. Having fallen asleep only in the middle of the night, Jane, accustomed to waking up early as a villager, was already up around 6 a.m. She went into the kitchen and decided to make some tea. Unfortunately, the girl didn't understand how to use an induction stove. They had a gas stove. Trudy emerged from the bedroom, squinting and yawning sleepily. "Jane, girl, why are you up so early?" she asked, pouring water into the kettle. "Greg is still asleep. He usually gets up at 8 or past. While you have breakfast and get ready, it'll be about 9. Then you'll go to the confectionery. It's too early now, you should sleep, Trudy advised. To Jane's surprise, Trudy put the kettle on the stove and tapped a few fingers on the shining panel. The girl watched the kettle with interest as it soon began to make a quiet noise boiling. Miracles, Jane thought. This is city life. But without revealing her surprise, she said aloud to Trudy, Aunt Trudy, I'm used to it. My mother didn't let me sleep. It's been like that since childhood. The chickens, the vegetable garden, the dough. Chickens? A vegetable garden? Trudy laughed, hugging the girl. Your words bring such a country spirit. As if I could smell the hay and fresh apples. And childhood. Trudy fell silent, lost in memories. How distant it all seemed now. Have you never regretted moving away, Aunt Trudy? Jane asked her. Well, at first, of course. It was lonely and unfamiliar. But remember, nobody was waiting for me back in the village. I never knew my father. My mum never wanted to talk about him. She moved to the village before I was born, from a village in the neighbouring region. No relatives. The year I moved here, she caught a bad cold. She was sick for months. A year after I graduated from high school, she passed away. That's how it went. Luckily, Greg came into my life soon after. Then family, a son. As if answering her words, Trudy's husband emerged from the bedroom, a home robe thrown over his shoulders. Entering the kitchen and squinting at the bright light, he said, What are you ladies doing up so early? Giggling? Making noise? You've woken me up. All right, Greg, we won't do it again, Trudy said, kissing her husband. Go back to bed. We'll sit quietly, talk and drink tea. Jane's an early bird. No way, the husband said jokingly. No way. Let's have breakfast. Meanwhile, Trudy had made tea in a large ceramic teapot, and keeping one eye on the frying eggs, was preparing sandwiches with cream cheese and red fish on the table next to the stove. After breakfast, Greg asked Jane to get ready. Trudy, having washed the dishes and wiped down the stove, stayed at home. She was the bookkeeper for her husband's chain of pastry shops and usually worked remotely. Having left home when she was young, she had immediately enrolled in accounting school and after graduating had practiced this profession for the rest of her life. At 9:30, Greg and Jane were already in the elevator going down. Greg's car was in the underground garage. Seated in the back, Jane looked around with interest, beginning to like the peculiarities of city life. She's going to be a city girl, Greg thought, noticing her curious look as he pulled the car into the street. Let's see how long your old-fashioned ways last here. Arriving at the pastry shop, Greg took Jane behind the counter and introduced her to Mrs. Tenner, a saleswoman at one of his confectioneries. Mrs. Tenner, tired of standing behind the counter, had decided to work in a quieter place for a few years before retirement and had recently announced her resignation to the manager. Leaving Jane under her care, Greg soon departed on his own business. Mrs. Tenner turned out to be a calm, friendly woman who treated Jane almost maternally. A couple of weeks flew by unnoticed. Mrs. Tenner resigned with peace of mind, as she had intended. Jane was doing a good job and spent her weekends with Trudy, helping with cleaning and preparing meals. She also visited home several times to see her mother and sister, helping with the vegetable garden and other pressing matters. However, most of her weekends were consumed by the road to hometown, leaving little time to be with her relatives. Trudy, noticing that the girl rarely went out in her spare time, thought it was time for Jane to live elsewhere. She believed it was time for the girl to become independent and make friends with her peers, instead of spending most of her time with her or at work. Moreover, Trudy's son was returning home for summer vacation soon. His final exams at the college were ending the following week, and he needed his room back. Soon, a suitable place for Jane was found. A clean, tidy hostel in a new multi-storey building, just a few blocks from Trudy and Greg's apartment. Jane could always quickly get to their home if needed, so Trudy wasn't worried about the girl's move. She reassured Lyneth, who called periodically. "Don't worry, dear. I'll look after your daughter." On the weekend, Trudy and Greg were going out of town. Greg's acquaintance was celebrating his birthday and had invited his circle of friends, including Greg, to celebrate at his country house. Trudy thought it would be nice to take Jane along, letting the girls socialise and meet some young people at the event. The birthday celebrant had invited families, so Jane wouldn't be bored among the adults. Greg didn't object to taking Jane. However, it turned out that her provincial style of clothes didn't quite match the event's level, and Trudy had to take Jane to a good woman's clothing and shoe store to choose something appropriate for the occasion. After trying on several dresses, they settled on one that emphasised Jane's beauty the most. The girl looked as if she had stepped off a catwalk. The colour and style combined so well, enhancing the impression of her striking appearance. Seeing herself in the mirror, Jane gasped in surprise. Though she knew she was beautiful, she never imagined that the right clothes could so enhance her natural features. But in the next moment, she gasped again, noticing the price tag. She couldn't believe clothes could cost so much. Trudy, noticing the girl's confusion, reassured her. "Don't be frightened. It's a normal price for a decent dress. As for the money, when you earn it you can pay it back. If you want to become a city dweller, get used to it." On Saturday morning, dressed up for the event, Greg and Trudy, accompanied by Jane, left home. They stopped by the stylist to have the women's hair and makeup done. In an hour everything was ready, so they got into the car and continued their journey out of town, towards the birthday celebrant's house. The tall, wrought iron gates of the country house slid open. Several expensive cars, belonging to guests who had already arrived, were parked in front of the house. More guests kept arriving. Jane got out of the car and looked around curiously. The owner himself was already walking towards them, arms extended in cordial welcome. After shaking hands with Greg, the host leaned over Trudy's hand but froze, his face changing. Jane, in her light, soft pink dress and silver open-toed heels, with her stunning youthful beauty, had clearly impressed him. "Greg, who have you brought with you today? Where did you find such beauty?" the man finally said. "Oscar, nice to meet you," added the birthday boy, as Greg introduced Jane. "Has your son found a bride? Who is this beautiful girl with such a lovely name? Jane." "No, thank God," Trudy smiled in reply. "It's too early for our boy to think about such things. Let him finish college first, not before." "And you, Jane, are you studying somewhere too?" Oscar asked, taking the girl by the elbow and leading her towards the house. Greg and Trudy exchanged glances and followed. It was clear that the girl had caught the birthday boy's interest. "Oscar, I can see you're more interested in Jane than in us," Greg said wryly, and Trudy laughed. "So we'll go have a drink in the meantime." "Greg, your jokes, as always, are tinged with sarcasm," Oscar remarked, still supporting Jane's elbow. "However, after 20 years of friendship, I've grown quite used to them. I'm interested in Jane because I've been looking for another salesperson for my store. She fits the bill perfectly. My store only employs young and beautiful girls, as you know. That's my work philosophy. Beauty in everything." "Yeah, I know." Greg rolled his eyes. "Like the fact that you never miss a chance with a beautiful girl. That's always been your style." Greg took his wife's arm. "Well, let's go have a drink to cool off from the journey, honey. It's hot today, and we should greet the other guests who have just arrived." The couple entered the house, where a table with soft drinks and light wines awaited the guests in the living room. "Well, here we go," thought Greg. "Now, let's see how our village girls' views will change." Aloud, he said, pouring his wife some crème de cassis into a tall glass. "Our birthday boy has certainly taken notice." Greg, please. Trudy took a sip from her glass. He said he needed another salesperson for the store. Besides, Jane is young enough to be his daughter, and would be more suitable for his son than for him, she remarked. Oscar owned several jewellery stores in the city. He had been divorced for many years and was considered an eligible bachelor. Despite never lacking female attention and always being open to socializing with beautiful women, none had managed to entice him into a serious relationship one more time. Remembering how his previous marriage ended, Oscar had vowed never to enter such a close relationship again. Few of his friends, let alone acquaintances, knew how difficult the divorce had been for Oscar, truly breaking his heart. It happened when his son was young. He discovered his wife had been cheating on him with his own brother for a year. A scandal erupted. The brothers stopped communicating, and Oscar, deaf to the cheater's objections, filed for divorce and sued for custody of his son. His wife refused to give up, continuing to fight for the child even after the divorce was finalized. Who would want to lose such a generous source of income as potential paternal alimony? Oscar, understanding her motives perfectly, did everything to keep his son. In this fight, all means were justified, so he didn't hesitate to take extreme measures. He planted illegal substances in his wife's purse and arranged for them to be discovered by the police. The shocked, cheating wife faced a real prison sentence, but the vengeful husband set his conditions. The police would immediately forget the incident if she ceased all attempts to gain custody of their son. Realizing she had lost, the woman withdrew all lawsuits and soon left town. Knowing her husband's character, she had no doubt he would see this through to the end. Their son Adrian initially missed his mother, but she had never been a particularly attentive parent. Between visiting beauty salons, expensive stores, and various social events, raising her child had clearly not been her priority. Adrian had grown accustomed to the presence of nannies, who were the ones truly responsible for his upbringing. Oscar, being a busy man, spent much time away from home. Having decided his son didn't need a new mother, he quietly left him in the care of professional nannies. Soon, Adrian graduated from school and then university. The topic of his mother became taboo between him and his father by default. She neither wrote nor inquired about her son's life. Sometimes it seemed to Adrian that she was no longer alive, or perhaps had never existed. All attempts to learn about his mother from his father ended in failure. Oscar shut down these conversations before they could begin. As Adrian grew older, other interests in life took precedence over pointless reflections on the fate of a negligent mother. Today, their son was also present at the event. He and his peers, who had arrived with their parents for the celebration, had gone to the lake for a swim. Jane was amazed by everything around her. Though unaccustomed to lavish events, the girl felt out of place. "Jane, so how do you feel about my proposal?" Oscar led the girl to a chair in the garden, shaded by trees. Seating her, he sat beside her and gazed curiously into her eyes. "Pretty. I haven't seen such a beauty in a long time," the man thought, observing Jane. No wonder. She grew up in the fresh air of this wilderness. A true natural beauty, no doubt. He grinned inwardly before speaking aloud. "Of course, you'll need to learn about being a jewellery store clerk, but I can see you're a smart girl. You seem at ease even in unfamiliar company. I'm sure you'll do fine. I'll sort things out with Greg. So are you willing to give it a try?" Jane pondered for a moment. She hadn't missed Oscar's attention to her as a young woman. Accustomed to male interest from men of all ages, she quickly recognized the signs in his behavior and looks. Her mother had always urged caution in choosing her company. "Daughter," Lilith would say, "men interpret things their own way. Don't be quick to smile at everyone if you want to choose the right man for yourself. Remember, men can misunderstand you and, losing their heads over your beauty, behave very inappropriately." Jane had always heeded her mother's words, typically maintaining a reserved demeanour with strangers. Oscar's behaviour seemed familiar, reminiscent of other men in similar situations. Despite his handsome, well-groomed appearance, Jane couldn't seriously consider a man with a grown son close to her own age. However, his offer intrigued her. Jane had visited a jewellery store only once, during a weekend outing with friends. The store, with its gleaming display cases and sparkling treasures, had seemed like a royal palace or Aladdin's cave to her. Clean work, a quiet schedule, good working conditions, and prospects for professional and financial growth. Jane agreed. "Excellent!" Oscar exclaimed. "Here comes my son, Adrian. Come meet Jane. Take care of her while I arrange the feast. It seems all the guests have arrived." Nodding to Jane, he summoned nearby waiters and headed into the house. Adrian looked at Jane. "Well, another dad's doll," he thought. "As soon as she's attracted, she'll be cast aside just as quickly." "Oh, who's this beautiful fairy?" one joked, a tall fellow with thick dark hair. 3 young men and a girl, children of the guests, approached. Their hair were still wet from swimming. "Adrian, introduce us. I'm Roy," he said, shaking Jane's hand. "This is Ellie, Jack and Ben." Roy laughed, dodging a playful slap from the red-haired, short and stocky Ben. "And you? Jane? Whose daughter are you? We've never seen you at an event like this before. Everyone would surely remember such a beautiful girl." "Jane is no one's daughter," Adrian interjected. "She's, as I understand it, Dad's new—" Adrian paused, searching for the right word. "Acquaintance," he finally settled on. "Not true," Jane protested indignantly. "What are you implying? I met your father 10 minutes ago when he offered me a job at his store." Everyone looked at Jane in surprise. Adrian thought, well, thank goodness at least one beautiful girl wasn't seduced by Dad's charm. Over the years since his mother's passing, Adrian had seen countless beautiful girls come and go in their house, courtesy of his father's fleeting interests. Adrian regarded Jane with curiosity. "She's just Dad's type," he admitted to himself. He had to concede that he also found the girl attractive, as did the other young men. Roy and Jack had already taken Jane by the arms, leading her to the snack table under the trees. Red-haired Ben followed, while Elle, spotting acquaintances, joined a group of women nearby. Adrian, feeling a twinge of jealousy, said, "Jane, please don't take offence. I was joking, and it seems my humour fell flat. May I make it up to you? Dad asked me to look after you, after all." He gently pushed Roy and Jack aside. "I'm in charge here, so it's my duty to entertain the ladies. You two go grab a drink. The feast will start soon. Take Ben with you, he looks bored." "Ooh, what a grip," Roy remarked, glancing at Jack. "Come on, Jack, let's go. We shouldn't interfere with the young master's socializing." The guys returned to the table, with Ben hesitantly following. Jane studied Adrian more closely. He resembles his father, tall, handsome. His initial assumption about me isn't nice, but it's understandable. He's obviously used to the way his father treated women. It shows in his behaviour, she thought. Adrian suggested a walk before dinner. They strolled towards the lake, each lost in their own thoughts. "Are you still studying?" she inquired. Adrian replied that he had graduated from college and planned to work in IT. "And I suppose you're getting married already?" Adrian asked, smiling. "I guess you're not short of proposals, are you? And you probably have a boyfriend. And it's definitely not my dad." He laughed, wondering how he could have initially thought that Jane was one of his father's temporary romantic interests. The girl laughed in response. "There is no boyfriend, and never has been," she replied to Adrian, who opened his eyes in surprise. "I don't want to rush into temporary relationships. I want something that lasts," she added firmly, looking into Adrian's eyes. "Well, well," he thought. So that's where all the normal girls are. In villages and hamlets, it turns out. You wouldn't think at first glance that she was from the provinces. Suddenly, Adrian's cell phone rang. Dinner was starting, and his father announced that everyone was waiting only for him and Jane at the set table. It suddenly seemed to Adrian that he could hear hidden jealousy in his father's displeased voice. Grinning, he took Jane by the elbow and led her back to the house. The party wound down only in the evening. The guests began to leave. Greg and Trudy declined the host's offer to stay and also began to pack for home. Throughout the day, Jane constantly caught Oscar's attentive gaze, who watched her with interest. Adrian also didn't leave her side. When Greg came to say goodbye to the birthday boy, Oscar took him aside, telling Trudy they needed one last business talk. Listen, Greg, I've been meaning to ask, what do you think of this girl, Jane? What are her plans for the future? What is she looking for? Does she have someone? A friend, boyfriend, fiancé? Anyone? Well, Oscar, it's clear nothing's changed with you. You're still the same old tomcat, chasing every skirt. Greg chuckled softly. I was never a tomcat while I was married, if you remember, Oscar retorted with a pout. Like a complete fool, I lived my life faithfully, and then, well, you know the rest. All right. Sorry, no offence, Greg said, conciliatorily. I didn't think this subject would touch such a nerve. As for Jane, you're hardly going to get anywhere. The girl was brought up with different moral principles. I don't know, of course, how city life will change her, Greg mused. Imagine that, an adult, and in fact, the beauty has never been with a man at all. When Oscar heard this, he couldn't believe his ears. He was convinced that the era of virgins had long passed. That's who I should marry, he thought. Trudy's voice came from afar. Getting into the car with Jane, she was calling her husband to come home. The day was drawing to a close, and they still had the journey back. Oscar took Jane's phone number to call about working in his store. Greg, upon learning that the girl was leaving his confectionery, began to protest. Once again, he'd have to look for a salesperson, but Oscar insisted on Jane's departure, promising to send a replacement personally within a couple of days. Has our Casanova fallen in love? Greg thought. At the beginning of the week, Jane moved into the dormitory. Trudy personally checked to ensure she was settled in. There was only one roommate living in the small room, also a young girl working at the grocery store on the next street. Jane had transferred to work in Oscar's jewellery store. The girl turned out to be a surprisingly quick learner. Not long ago, appearing for the first time in the store, she had gasped with delight, looking at the sparkling showcases. But after quickly completing her training, grasping everything on the fly, Jane soon took her place behind the counter, among the shining jewellery mirror shelves. She liked the diamonds the most, from the very beginning. Looking at them, the girl could not take her eyes off the jewellery. Oscar, who brought Jane to the store for her first visit, immediately noticed this. He looked at the girl with interest and said, I see that you like diamonds. You have good taste, I must say. Oscar had no doubts that he had found the path to the beauty's heart and mentally celebrated his victory. You know, Jane, let's do it this way. If you work well, sell your products effectively and get regular customers, you'll receive a bonus for your good work from me personally. The director paused. And it will be an item with a diamond. Jane looked at Oscar with delight, her eyes shining with joy. Don't doubt it, Mr. Hildebrand. I'll definitely try, Jane assured him. She already envisioned a sparkling ring on her hand. For you, I'm just Oscar, said the director, not doubting that soon the beautiful Jane would become much closer for him. However, the director hadn't expected that the girl's appearance behind the counter of his store would have such an unexpected effect. When, having completed her internship, Jane appeared at her workplace on the first day of her independent work, Oscar, who came to the store for this occasion and saw the girl standing among the sparkling diamond showcases, simply lost the power of speech from the excess of emotion. Jane's beauty seemed to be enhanced by the radiance of the jewellery surrounding her. Customers entering the store, especially men, were captivated by the sight that greeted them. Jane's sales surpassed those of all other sellers. Many who just came to admire her beauty left with purchases. Men choosing gifts for their wives and girlfriends invariably asked Jane to try on the selected items, usually resulting in a sale. Women secretly aspiring to be as beautiful as Jane also preferred to buy jewellery from her. Oscar was elated, rubbing his hands with glee. The store's profits had noticeably increased, bringing him closer to his cherished goal of winning over the beauty. Suddenly, the director had an idea: to advertise his business with Jane as the face of his chain of stores. On the next day off, Oscar arranged an advertising photo shoot for Jane, promising to pick her up around noon. The girl was a bit nervous, having never participated in a photo shoot before and unsure how to style herself. However, her worries proved unfounded. A stylist was waiting at the photo studio, ready to do Jane's hair and makeup. Oscar personally selected some clothes for the shoot from a high-end boutique. Jane tried on each outfit to determine the most flattering one. The photo shoot was a great success. Upon seeing Jane, the photographer remarked that she would be well suited for a career as a photo model. The session lasted about 2 hours. When it was over, the tired girl prepared to change. However, Oscar stopped her, saying, "Jane, you're a natural photo model. For your hard work, you deserve a prize, in fact, more than one. Remember, I promised you a bonus for good work? Well, here it is." The director produced a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. A diamond ring sparkled on a dark blue pad. Jane gasped with delight as Oscar slipped it onto her slender finger. As the owner of a jewellery store chain, he knew quality pieces well. The ring was small but exquisite, perfectly suited to Jane's hand. "Well, do you like it?" Oscar asked, pleased with her reaction. "But that's not all. All the clothes I chose for the photo shoot are now yours. You can keep them, and I'll cover the cost." He joked as Jane began to object. In truth, the man had planned this from the start, never doubting that the girl would accept everything as a gift. All the items Oscar chose complemented Jane beautifully. His understanding of fashion rivaled his knowledge of jewellery. Now it was up to him to see his plan through to the end. Oscar took the girl to a French restaurant. Jane, never having been to such a place before, felt slightly out of her element. The menu items were written in French. Noticing her hesitation, Oscar took charge and placed an order for both of them, conversing with the waiter in fluent French. After sipping champagne, Jane felt the wine's effects. She rarely drank alcohol, and the bubbly left her feeling slightly dreamy. Having sampled French dishes whose names eluded her, Jane prepared to leave, and Oscar offered her a ride home. As they drove away from the restaurant, he suggested, "Jane, what if we go somewhere else? It's your day off, and we have plenty of time. You're always at work anyway. The weather's splendid. How about we drive to the countryside? What do you say?" Oscar glanced at Jane attentively. The girl, fatigued from the photo shoot and mellowed by the champagne, leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. Seeing that Jane had dozed off, Oscar steered the car out of town. They came to a stop on a secluded riverbank. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the sandy shore. Jane opened her eyes, looked around and asked, "Where are we?" Oscar grinned and smiled wordlessly at Jane. "We're outside the city. As you can see, my summer house is nearby. Remember when you came here with Greg and Trudy for my birthday? That's where we first met," Oscar said, taking Jane's hand. Ever since then I realized I'd never before encountered such a beautiful girl. Mr. Hildebrand, Jane withdrew, removing her hand from his arm. I appreciate your kind words, but I'd like to go home now, please. Realizing the boss's intentions, Jane decisively chose to halt any unwelcome advances. Oscar was visibly disappointed by her reaction. Having lost his composure while alone with the girl, he had assumed that after spending time together and receiving gifts, the beauty would become more receptive to him. What more could she want? She's just a price-tagging girl, the man thought irritably, then said aloud, You know, Jane, I'm a fairly well-to-do man, and I'm not married, as you're aware. Do you realize how many girls would love to be in your position right now? I've done everything I could as your boss and as a man, yet you don't seem to appreciate it. Oscar gazed reproachfully into the girl's eyes. Mr. Hildebrand, if you think I don't deserve your gifts, I can return everything. I can even quit your store tomorrow, the girl added, fumbling for the car door handle. Jane, come on, you misunderstood me, the man said, unable to believe his ears. He hadn't expected such a reaction from the beauty. Usually, girls in such situations were much more cooperative. You know, Mr. Hildebrand, Jane continued, perhaps you're not used to girls like me. We have different ideas and habits in your city, and I don't want to be just a beautiful toy in a man's hands. It may not make sense to you, but that's how my mum raised me. I believe it's more correct to marry first, and to marry the person you love, before entering into close relationships. I'm sorry, but it won't be any other way, she said resolutely to the silent man. Okay, I understand. Oscar finally broke the silence. He had realized that the beauty wouldn't give up so easily. So much for the village simpleton. She doesn't want to barter for less, and wants to grab everything for herself at once. And if I start courting you, as you think is right, what would you say? Will you accept my advances? Oscar asked, thinking that for such a beauty it might be worth losing his bachelor freedom. I don't know what to say to that, replied Jane. What she wanted most right now was to go home and go to bed. Besides, Oscar's behaviour frightened her a little, and she was anxious to get out of this dangerous situation as soon as possible. Jane, at least promise to think about my proposal, said Oscar, starting the car. The more the beauty rebuffed his advances, the more he wanted to win her favour. Jane promised to think about her boss's proposal, although admittedly she wasn't particularly interested in him. To be quite honest, after meeting the director's son at the birthday party, Jane realised that it was Adrian who had caught her interest. After that first acquaintance, she and Adrian communicated repeatedly via messengers and met several times, walking, going to the movies, and sitting in open summer cafes. But Adrian never once showed that he liked Jane, except for those quick, rapturous glances she noticed sometimes. Feeling that Adrian liked her, she expected quite different behaviour from him, but she didn't know that the guy, seeing his father's interest in Jane, didn't want to compete with him over her. Moreover, she didn't know that right after her departure from the birthday party, Oscar, looking seriously at his son, had hinted at his interest in her and advised his son to switch to some other beauty. Not considering it possible to argue with his father, Adrian had then nodded silently in response. On Monday, Jane went to work as usual. On her finger sparkled the ring presented by the boss, and in her ears were diamond earrings, which she wore specially to work. The director had ordered this to seduce customers, and hinted that Jane could keep these earrings in the future for good work, as well as the earlier ring. What to answer Oscar? Jane hadn't decided yet. That same day she video-called Lyneth and told her about what had happened, proudly showing her admiring mother the gifted ring and clothes. I knew it would be like this, Lyneth cried with joy. What is there to think about? Agree! After all, he's not cold. Not a freak of some kind? And he's even willing to take care of you." Her mother didn't doubt for a moment that her daughter had drawn the lucky ticket and would very soon receive a marriage proposal from a worthy man. "Mum, I don't like him," her daughter tried to object hesitantly. "Yes, he's a bit old for me too. I like his son Adrian better." "Daughter, what are you saying?" Lilith reproachfully remarked. "You need a husband, not some boy. These types like Adrian have wind in their heads. How can they marry? Don't even think about it." Jane understood that her mother was right, of course, but she couldn't decide what to do. The girl's roommate, having involuntarily overheard the conversation, looked enviously at Jane dozing off on her bed. "Why are some people so lucky? They wouldn't have to propose to me twice," she thought with annoyance, and looked at the sleeping Jane almost with hatred. "So what if she's a supermodel? How am I any worse? Why do some people get everything and others get nothing?" The neighbour, like Jane, came from a small town, but from the other end of the region. Having firmly decided to make her way in life, she soon found out that no one was waiting for her in this city. There was plenty of work, but all of it with low wages and long shifts. And this one, no sooner had she arrived, immediately found a cushy job and a suitor ready not only to invest, but to get married right away. Snorting with indignation and throwing an angry look in the direction of the napping Jane, the neighbour grabbed the kettle and went to the kitchen to cook dinner. "Okay, we'll see how it turns out," she thought grudgingly, putting the kettle on the stove in the kitchen. It was the end of the week, and Jane still hadn't made a decision about Oscar. To avoid worrying her mother unnecessarily, the girl pretended to agree with her opinion about the boss's proposal, but she herself didn't know what to say to him. The man appeared closer to the weekend. He offered to give her a ride home, which caused envious glances from another sales clerk. Realizing from her silence that Jane didn't know how to respond to his proposal, Oscar decided not to pressure her, and instead take matters into his own hands. "Jane, I have an idea for the weekend," he said, starting the car. "What are your thoughts on visiting your mum? I'm really looking forward to meeting her, both as your supervisor and as a possible future husband." At these words, Oscar, without taking his eyes off the road, reached behind to the back seat. A huge bouquet of bright pink garden lilies fell onto the girl's lap. "By the way, I insist. Let's call your mum right now and announce our arrival. Give me your cell phone," Oscar said, not allowing Jane to catch her breath or start objecting. Taking Jane's phone, he stopped the car and, finding Lilith's number, called her. His call caused a storm of excitement in her mother. The man arranged their arrival, and Jane, realizing that these two had decided everything for her, kept silent for the most part, resigning herself to let things unfold as they may. Oscar had no doubt that the mother would become his ally in winning her daughter. What mother would refuse such an opportunity? Satisfied with himself, he confidently spun the steering wheel, driving Jane towards the dormitory to get ready for the trip. Not wanting to waste any more time, he decided to leave for Lyneth's that day. Lyneth was beside herself with joy and excitement, rushed to prepare the festive meal. The sun had already set when Oscar's car drove into Lilith's yard. The man, beaming with a friendly, open smile, got out of the car and offered his hand to Jane, who was sitting in the front seat. Oscar introduced himself and gallantly bowed over Lilith's hand, causing the mother undisguised delight. Mother and daughter embraced. Tears of happiness stood in Lilith's eyes. "Well, it's done," Oscar thought triumphantly, following the women into the house. The weekend passed imperceptibly. Oscar didn't leave Lilith's side. From their conversations it was clear that these two were already making plans for a possible wedding between him and Jane. The girl herself kept to herself, not participating in their conversations, preferring her sister's company. "Jane, do you really like your boss, this Oscar?" Sue asked once, noticing that the future bride didn't look particularly happy. "I don't like him very much," she added doubtfully in response to the silence. Sue knew her sister well, so she could see that Jane didn't like her boss, no matter how much their mother tried to convince her eldest daughter that it was impossible not to take such a chance. Lilith felt herself in seventh heaven. She fussed around her daughter's future husband, trying to do him all sorts of favours. Taking a chance when he wasn't around, Lilith, seeing Jane's mood unsuited to the occasion, decided to talk to her. "Jane, daughter, why are you so sad?" asked her mother, putting a mug of tea in front of her daughter and putting an arm around her shoulder. "Look how things have turned out." "Mum," Jane said resolutely, "I don't want to marry him. Understand?" "Daughter," Lilith interrupted her sternly, "you're a grown woman, and you realise not everyone is as lucky as you've been. Look at your roommate in the dormitory, an orphan, not a penny to her name, works in the store from morning till night, and spends all weekends just sleeping it off. You think I can't see how she looks at you? I feel sorry for the girl, but that's just the way it is. What about you? Do you appreciate what you already have in your life?" Lilith fell silent, looking seriously at her daughter. Jane thought that she hadn't seen her mother so strict and unyielding in a long time. "Well, here's what we'll do," her mother softened. "Let's decide once and for all. This chance must not be missed. Oscar is ready to marry even now. You can see how in love with you he is. After all, he's a grown-up, serious man, not a boy like your Adrian, his son. Daughter, forget about his son, a silly boy who hasn't achieved anything in life yet." "Mum, he's not stupid. He graduated with honours from the college, and now he works at an IT company and earns good money too. And what do you mean, boy? He's even older than me. He'll be 24 soon." Jane tried to object. "That's enough, Jane." Lilith waved her hand at her daughter, and Jane realised that it was useless to argue with these two. The week after the weekend, Oscar openly discussed the upcoming wedding celebration with Jane in a tone that brooked no objections. Every day he called Lilith, seeking her advice on the guest list, menu and venue. He tried his best to win over Jane's mother, promising her a diamond ring like Jane's as a wedding gift. Overhearing this conversation by chance, Jane was stunned. The next day, when she and her mother spoke, Jane exclaimed, "Mum, how could you? He's bought you, and you've sold me." "How dare you say that?" her mother retorted. "I'm only trying to do what's best for you, you ungrateful child." The women almost quarrelled then. Adrian, of course, was aware of the impending wedding. He couldn't reconcile himself to the fact that Jane would soon become his father's wife. He understood that the girl had no desire to marry his father at all. Adrian also realised that Jane had feelings for him. However, the promise he'd made to his father forced him to keep quiet about his own feelings for her. But one day, Adrian could no longer bear it and decided to talk to Jane, come what may. He called her and suggested they meet. Jane readily agreed, knowing that after the wedding, Oscar was unlikely to allow her to freely communicate with his son. The weather was dry and warm. Jane and Adrian met and decided to sit on a park bench under the shade of large, old ash trees. "Jane, tell me, do you want to marry my father?" Adrian asked. "Mother wants it very much," the girl replied quietly. After a pause, she added, "To be honest, I don't really want to. I can't say anything bad about your father, but—" Jane trailed off. Adrian looked at her resolutely and said, "Then don't marry him. Marry me instead." "Are you joking?" The girl looked at him incredulously. "That's quite a joke." "No, Jane, I'm not joking at all." Adrian took her hand. "I realised it not long ago, but now I'm certain. I love you. Will you be my wife?" Adrian knelt before Jane, who was still seated on the bench. He took a small velvet box from his jeans pocket and opened it. Inside, Jane saw a beautiful ring that sparkled and shimmered in the sunlight, filtering through the leaves. "Will you marry me?" Adrian asked, holding out the ring to Jane. "Say yes! What's there to think about?" Jane and Adrian hadn't noticed the small crowd that had gathered nearby. 2 young men with their girlfriends waved at Jane, encouraging her to accept. A couple with 2 children, playing in a nearby sandbox, nodded approvingly. Even a man walking his dog watched the scene with interest, phone in hand. "Yes," Jane said joyfully, her face beaming with happiness. The onlookers cheered approvingly. Someone jokingly shouted, "Kiss!" Adrian took Jane's hand and led the blushing girl towards the park exit. They still faced a difficult task, talking to Oscar. Jane's hands trembled as she feared the impending conversation, but Adrian gently took her hand. "Don't worry, I'll handle everything. The main thing is that you've agreed. Leave the rest to me. We'll have a good life together. Look, the ring I gave you is even bigger than Dad's," Adrian joked, trying to ease the tension that gripped Jane. Jane wasn't thinking about the material benefits of being with Adrian. She didn't care how much larger his ring was compared to his father's. While elated by Adrian's proposal, she simultaneously dreaded the conversation with Oscar. But the moment Oscar saw his son in the doorway holding Jane's hand, he understood instantly. After listening to Adrian, he reacted with surprising calm. "I see you've made your choice, Jane," Oscar said dryly. "Well, I wish you happiness." Seeing the girl's radiant face, he realized he had lost and saw no point in further pursuit of Jane. "Well, I can't fight with my own son over this. We'll see how things turn out," Oscar thought, forcing a smile. The wedding day arrived. Lyneth, already dressed up, stood in the middle of her daughter's dormitory room early in the morning. Under the envious glances of Jane's roommate, she helped her daughter prepare for the wedding. A stylist had arrived to do the bride's hair and makeup. Soon everything was ready. Jane, radiant with beauty, admired herself in the large mirror of the wall closet. She felt utterly happy. Even her anxiety about the rejected Oscar, who might harbour resentment, finally dissipated. Everything was set for the ceremony, only Oscar was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly there was a commotion. The doors burst open, and Oscar strode in, accompanied by police. Everyone stared in shock. "The wedding is cancelled," Oscar announced. "I won't let my son marry a thief. Jane, you're coming with us to the police station." He grabbed the girl's arm roughly, pulling her towards the door. "Be quiet, Adrian. You should have realized this girl is a hunter of rich men." Oscar snapped at his son, who tried to obstruct his father. "The mere ease with which she's switched to you already says a great deal about her aims." "We are compelled to detain you on suspicion of stealing jewellery from the store where you work," said one policeman. "You'd better comply voluntarily. Otherwise, we'll be forced to handcuff you," he added, leading Jane out of the room under Oscar's triumphant gaze. Adrian and Lilith rushed after them. The ceremony was interrupted. Those present froze in bewilderment. Accusing the girl of theft, Oscar insisted on immediately searching her dorm room. Allegedly, the storm had been re-inventorized today, and several expensive pieces of jewellery were missing. It turned out that the items had disappeared during Jane's shift. The police took the trembling Jane, along with the gloating Oscar and the sobering Lilith, who leaned on Adrian's shoulder, straight to Jane's dormitory. Krista, Jane's neighbour, was sitting on her bed as usual, watching a video on her phone. When everyone entered the room, the police ordered everyone to stay seated and began examining Jane's bed, nightstand, and closet shelves. Then one of the policemen said, "Suspect, come to the closet. What's that?" He pointed to a small velvet pouch lying on a shelf under the linens. Jane, seeing it, was speechless. The policeman dumped the contents of the pouch on the bed. Lilith shrieked and sobbed. On the bedspread lay a handful of brightly sparkling jewels. Oscar, triumphant, immediately confirmed that these were the very pieces missing from his store. Suddenly, Lilith had a hunch. Looking around, she realized that Krista had disappeared in the commotion. Going out into the corridor and glancing around, Lilith saw the girl sitting on the stairs near the window. Withdrawn into herself, Krista sat silently, staring out into the street. "Krista," said Lilith, approaching her, "do you know anything about these found things?" The neighbour shook her head in response. Lilith, however, noticed a ring on Krista's finger and said, "Krista, my dear, I see you're not a bad person. It was Oscar who bribed you, wasn't it? Did you put those things in Jane's closet? Don't take it out on me. Confess. If your daughter is convicted on her wedding day, you'll have to live with it. You'll live with your conscience, and there's nothing you can do about it. Don't be silent." Lilith took Krista's hands and looked intently into her eyes. "Even if my daughter is condemned, will it make you happy? Admit it. Didn't you put those things in the closet? Believe me, it's not too late to say the truth." Barely holding back her tears, Krista suddenly broke down. At that moment, it seemed to her that it wasn't Lilith standing before her, but her own mother, whose loss Krista had struggled to accept in childhood. Wiping away her tears, Krista resolutely jumped off the windowsill and headed for her room. The police continued their search. "Jane didn't take those things," Krista said loudly as she entered the room. "It was he who gave them to me to hide on Jane's shelf," she continued, taking off the ring and shoving it into Oscar's hands. Dazed with surprise, he remained silent, not knowing what to say in reply. "Well, father," Adrian broke the silence, "after that, you no longer have a son." Oscar realized he had lost again. Afraid of a scandal that could damage his reputation, he took the police officers aside, trying to settle the unfavourable situation. Lilith, embracing Jane and Adrian, wept silently. "Well, everything is resolved. I think we still have time to get married," Adrian said with a smile. "What will happen now, if this is how our life together begins?" said Jane, feeling suddenly tired. "I know what will happen," her husband-to-be answered confidently. "Now, everything will definitely be fine."